Okay, so I'm now recording. We're going to begin this year. So I have a little bit, I'll be honest, it's been a strange week and I have a little bit of a headache. So we are going to finish Muktzah tonight. That promise I will keep. But I want to begin with a story. And the story may seem random, but it has to do with the shir and it has to do with Muktzah. So several years ago, I'm sure everybody remembers the three kidnapped boys in Eretz Yisrael. We were all davening for them. Unfortunately, the story did not have a happy ending. At the time when this was going on, there was a rumor that Rabbi Elyashiv, Rabbi Yamin Elyashiv, the eldest son of the famous Rabbi Elyashiv, there was a rumor that he did a Garel Hagra. I don't know if people know what the Garel Hagra is. The Garel Hagra is a method of opening up a Tanakh in a certain fashion and asking it a question, and the answer will be given to you. A very mystical concept that's been around for many generations. There are many famous stories relating to it, especially when it comes to the state of Israel in particular, and missing soldiers. Pretty amazing stories. But in any event, that he did the Garel Hagra. So I called him and this is before the boys were found, that we didn't know what was going to be. So my magazine asked me if I would write about the history of the Garel Hagra, the halachos pertaining to it. Could anybody willy-nilly ask a question to a Tanakh and open it up, and also this event? So I called him, Rabbi Yamin Elyashiv, and he confirmed the story that he did do the Garel Hagra. And he told me the pasuk. In fact, if you would like, I could even tell you what the pasuk was. The pasuk was, give me 1 second. The pasuk was in Shoftim, Perek Tesvav, pasuk Yudalid. I'm going to read you the English translation. He, referring to Shimshon, came to Lehi, and the Philistines shouted at him. A spirit of Hashem came over him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that had been singed in fire. His bonds melted from upon his hands. So it's interesting because not only does this pasuk reference being taken captive, but the Philistines shouting with excitement over their prisoner. So it was. So I published the article, and the magazine said we can't publish it. So why can't you publish it? I mean, everything is cross-checked. It's accurate. And they said, you have to give a happy ending. You have to say that we see from here that the boys will be found. Unfortunately, I acquiesced. I said, okay, if you want to give it a positive ending, that we're hopeful that this is a sign, you can do that. I'm just warning you that if they're found dead, then it's going to actually cause a weakening of Torah. And unfortunately, we know what happened. And now when you look back at the verse, it's quite clear that it had negative connotations. So why am I telling you this in a class about Muktzah? Because, let me just get a chumash. Because this article forced me to go over the Kabbalistic concepts related to giving classes. And Chassam Sofer says, for example, that if ever you have a question about your life, read the Parsha that week. It will give you answers. And the Vilna Gaon and others point out when you start a class and you learn with a group, you'll see signs that this is a good class to give in the study of that week's Parsha. So this past Shabbos, while Joey was laning, we came across the following pasuk, that after the whole event of Yosef revealing himself and Yaakov and the Shvatim are now moving to Goshen, Paro wants to meet everybody. He wants to meet the family, like a press conference. So what does Yosef do? Yosef doesn't want to show Paro all of his brothers or the strong members of the family, Shimon and Levi, Yehuda. These were warriors. He didn't want to cause Paro any reason to fear. So he showed him he introduced him to 5 of the weakest of the brothers. And the language the pasuk uses, I believe, is the first time we have the word Muktzah in all of the Torah. So this is, if you have a Chumash available, it's chapter 47, Pasuk, verse 3, Mem Zayin Gimel, Vayomer Paray, Pasuk Beis, Mem Zayin Beis, Umiktzei Achiv Lakach. Yosef took from the smallest of his brothers. So Art Scroll translates it as the least of his brothers. And Rashi informs us, Minha Pchutim. So that's Art Scroll typically follows Rashi. From the smallest of their brothers, She'ein Niram Geburim. So they wouldn't appear like they're a strong family moving into the neighborhood. But the point being is this is what Muktzah means. Muktzah means set aside. Don't worry about it. It's not on your mind. Or as Ira said last week, the corner of a field. So let's very briefly review what we did last week and conclude with the basic idea of what Muktzah is. So last week we gave the history that this was invented by Nehemiah in the days preceding the second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple. And there is no corollary in the real world about Muktzah. Every other halacha exists in the secular world in some vein. Muktzah is this concept which is very hard to explain to someone new to the faith. And that's because it was a legal fiction created to save Shabbos. And we gave last week several reasons why Muktzah of all things was invented. You could review last week's shir. We gave 3 or 4 explanations as to how Muktzah protects Shabbos. And they're fairly convincing, obviously, because it's still around today. And we also finally explain what Muktzah means. Muktzah does not mean something which is forbidden to use on Shabbos, and therefore it's Muktzah. That may be a type of Muktzah, but all Muktzah means, as this pasuk alludes to, is something set aside, something of little value, right? The least of the brothers, Yosef introduced to Paro. All Muktzah means is an assumption that we make before Shabbos of any utensil in your home or item that we assume will be in disuse over Shabbos. So anything that we could assume that you were never planning on using on Shabbos is what we call Muktzah. And that's a very important reprogramming of our head. It is. I was speaking to Rabbi Hochberg this week about another matter, and we started talking a little bit about Muktzah, and I shared with him what I said in the class that, and by the way, the classes that I give here are the same classes I would give to a smicha program. These are high-level classes in the sense, I'm not coming here to tell you this is mutter, this is aser. We're actually going through everything historically leading up to the final halacha. And I said one thing that I pushed very hard is that Muktzah does not mean what people think it means. And in fact, before last week, people generally, the world over, always have a hard time defining what Muktzah is. And I said to Rabbi Hochberger, I said that Muktzah, all it means, if someone asks you about tshuva, what is Muktzah? It's anything we could assume you weren't planning on using on Shabbos. Those things you cannot move, although you are allowed to touch. And Rabbi Hochberg laughed. He said Rabbi Soloveitchik used to always say the same thing. Rabbi Soloveitchik in his smicha class, Rabbi Hochberg remembered, would always say, all Muktzah means is eino mucham. It's not prepared for Shabbos use. And that's a very important reprogramming. And I'm going to ask you to think about that in your head from time to time so it gets settled in your brain. Okay. So that's, and then we finally concluded with exceptions to Muktzah. So that's what we're going to start this week. Before we get into, you know what, actually, we'll get back to exceptions. Let's actually start at a different place this week because I really want to conclude the laws of Muktzah. Now, let me say before I go on, whenever I say, we're doing Amir La'akum, a Shabbos guy, I think we did that in a 3-week program. We did Shabbos lights in a 2-week program. And now we're doing Muktzah in a 2-week program. Obviously, we're all smart enough to be aware that Muktzah is quite complex. And we could go on and on and on for a year about Muktzah. It's endless. But what I want to give you are the tools to A, be able to understand it, B, be able to paskin for yourself, and C, to know when you have a question to ask a rabbi. And you'll be way ahead of the game. So let's actually continue this week with the categories of Muktzah. Because now when I say the word categories of Muktzah, All that means are the categories for which we could assume you weren't going to use something on Shabbos. So, and this is taken from Rabbi Yosef Cairo, this list. So category number one, we actually alluded to last week, is Muktzah Machmas Chisaron Kis. Things that we assume for you that you weren't planning on using on Shabbos because of their expense. So we all have paintings in our house. We all have some fancy things that we never take out, we never use, they're there for show. I use the example of a rookie card, an expensive rookie card. These are things that are Muktzah on Shabbos, separated, right? Because we are assuming that you were never planning on using it. So that is category number one of Muktzah, and we'll see some distinctions in a moment. I would advise everybody to take some notes. I hate to say this, for the rest of the classes that on this series, you're not gonna have to do this. But Muktzah is a little bit confounding. I have to tell you, I was nervous all day how to give this secondary class. You know, how do I just sum everything up in one last year? So I'm trying my best. This is a little bit more complex than the average class that we're gonna give. So that's category number one. It's called Muktzah, Machmas, Chisaron Kis, things that have been set aside for this use due to their extreme value. Now, value doesn't necessarily mean monetary value. It could just be your personal emotional value. You may have a picture of your great-great-grandmother when she was 4 years old, the last remaining piece when your parents escaped before the Holocaust, and that's all that remains, and it sits in a very special picture frame up on the mantle. That's Muktzah. It's valueless outside your house. You know, no one who's not related to you will pay a penny for it. But for you, so Muktzah Machmas Chisaron Kis just means something that's valuable, and due to its value, either monetary, emotional, you're not planning on touching. Number two is actually the Muktzah that we're all familiar with, the Muktzah that you would have used. If I would have asked you what Muktzah is, you would have used this category, and that is a kli shemalachto le'iser, an iPhone, a flashlight, a remote control, a television, a computer, a fan, I don't know, whatever the case may be. These are things that are Muktzah because they are a utensil whose major purpose is for prohibition. So what that means is we could conclude that before Shabbos, you weren't planning on using your iPhone, right? I think that's a fair assumption. So the reason why an iPhone is Muktzah is not because that's what Muktzah is. No. The reason why an iPhone is Muktzah is because we are assuming that you were never planning on utilizing it on Shabbos. Now, why were you not planning on utilizing it on Shabbos? Because it's a utensil whose major use is done in a forbidden fashion. So a hammer is the classic example. A hammer is a utensil that's used typically for forbidden activity, building. Therefore, we could assume you were never planning on using a hammer on Shabbos, okay? Because it's a kli shemalachto le'iser. Another category is Muktzah. We're going to give 5 categories. You don't have to memorize them, but it helps, again, reprogram ourselves to understand what Muktzah is. Another category is Muktzah Machmas Gufo. Inherently, we know that you are not planning on using this item because the item is not a utensil. It has no use. So the classic example of this is a rock. Now, I don't mean a rock that you took before Shabbos and you said, I declare that this rock is going to be a paperweight. Of course you can use that. I mean, many things in your house are made from rocks. That's okay. I mean, a rock in the street, that is inherently Muktzah. We had the right to assume that because this does not take the form of a utensil and no one was planning on using this, this is inherently Muktzah. A stick is another example. And surprise, surprise, what falls under the category of Muktzah Machmas Gufo, something which is inherently Muktzah, is money. Money is not a kli shemalachto le'iser. There's no biblical violation of going, this may shock you, but if I take money and I go to the store on Shabbos and I buy a bag of potatoes, I didn't violate biblical law. There's no biblical violation of purchasing potatoes or doing any monetary purchase on Shabbos. Rather, money falls under the category of something which is inherently useless on Shabbos. It's not a vessel, it's not a utensil, it has no use other than buying things. And since we're assuming you're not going to buy something, it's muktzah. The fourth and penultimate category is this. Tefillin, which is muktzah machmas mitzvah, lulav, esrog, shofar, tefillin. Any mitzvah that you can't do on Shabbos, we could assume you were never planning on touching it. So because we could assume that the men were not planning on touching their tefillin, and the men and women were not planning on touching their lulav and esrog on Shabbos, and no one was planning on touching the shofar this year, the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, we could assume it was in disuse, and it's muktzah, and that's called muktzah machmas mitzvah. So again, all of these categories are muktzah by definition of things we assume you wouldn't use. And here are the 5 categories of when we could assume for you, so objectively, that you were not planning on using these items, and therefore they're muktzah. And once you know these 5 categories, you'll be able to figure it out for yourself. So again, so far,
Rabbi, just a second, what about buses ledavar haser?
Ira, you want to know about buses? We're going to get to buses soon. Let's first get through the category. So Ira is talking about a very serious category, but we'll talk about that soon. It's not its own category, as we'll soon explain. I do want to say before I continue, this, from all the Shabbos shiurim, this might be the most complicated tonight, and I don't apologize for it, of course, but I would advise you get a video of the shiur, because we video them every week, and you review it just to remember it. I think there's an ability on Zoom, when you listen to a recording back, you could put it at double speed if you want to record it quickly. Okay, so we had, again, all muktzah means are things we assume you're not going to use, and those things you're not allowed to move. You could touch them, but you can't move them on Shabbos. How do we program our brain to know what do Chazal objectively assume we're not going to use? Things that are emotionally or monetarily expensive, we don't touch on a Tuesday. We're certainly not planning on touching on a Shabbos. Things that their only use is forbidden, like a remote control, an iPhone, and other things. So we could assume you're not going to use it on Shabbos. Things that are inherently valueless in the sense that they're no utensil, they serve no purpose, like a rock in the street. But again, you could take a rock before Shabbos and designate it. But short of designating it, we assume that's muktzah. And then muktzah machmas mitzvah, by dint of it being a mitzvah, and that mitzvah doesn't apply on Shabbos, it's muktzah. And that's why a shofar is muktzah Shabbos or Rosh Hashanah. That's why lulav and esrog is muktzah on Sukkot. That's why your sukkah decorations are muktzah on Sukkot, because you made it to beautify the sukkah. You were never planning on utilizing it. And then finally, the last category, the 5th category, is really its own category, and that's nolad. Nolad, and this is especially important for the foxes, nolad means something which didn't exist before Shabbos. So the classic example is a chicken egg. Anything which comes into formation on Shabbos, by definition, we could assume you were never planning on using it. It didn't exist. And you can't plan for something that didn't exist yet. So those are your 5 categories. Now, are we going to run through every type of utensil in your house and try to figure out which category it goes into? Most likely, all of you know intuitively what's muktzah, but now you know the basic categories. Now, you may be wondering, is there other than memorization and figuring out for your house what's muktzah, is there any benefit of knowing these categories? So the answer is yes, and we'll get to that in a moment. So let's put that on the back burner for a moment. Let's put Ira's point on the back burner for a moment. And let me discuss a whole other section of muktzah that we're not really going to talk about, but you need to be aware of. So what we discussed so far are the general principles of muktzah, the things, I know I say this a million times, the things that we assume objectively you're not planning on using on Shabbos. But there's a whole other category of muktzah that I found so many people don't know about, or they think this is the only type of muktzah. And that is muktzah machmas iser. Things that are muktzah, not because you were planning not to use it on Shabbos, but because utilizing those items may lead to a prohibition. Now, many people would have assumed that that's what muktzah is. You can't move Muktzah on Shabbos because you may do something wrong with it. And as we've talked about last week and this week, so you have over an hour of material. That's not all Muktzah means is we just assume you weren't going to use it. Therefore, you can't use it on Shabbos for the reasons we gave last week. 4 reasons why that helps Shabbos out. But there is a separate category. So you're right somewhat. There is this separate concept of a whole other concept of Muktzah, of things you can't do because it may lead to a prohibition. So I want to give you 2 examples that where this type of Muktzah comes up. So this is really the exception to the rule, although many people associate this with Muktzah. This is actually the exception to the rule. There are only a small handful of cases of these. So let me give you a few. Now, first of all, in modern times, an iPhone may fall into this category. Because what happens if I move my iPhone on Shabbos? Besides the fact that I move Muktzah, what might happen to the iPhone if I move it?
Wake it up.
You're going to wake it up. And if you wake it up, you just did an Isser. So it could be an iPhone also falls into Muktzah because it may actually cause a prohibition. But here are 2 examples that people may not know. Number 1 is wet clothing. Believe it or not, this is halacha and Shulchan Aruch, that any clothing that was wet going into Shabbos is Muktzah the rest of Shabbos. And in fact, you can't touch wet clothing on Shabbos. So this doesn't apply, by the way, if you're wearing clothing and you get stuck in the rain, the decree doesn't apply to that for reasons you don't have time to go into. So don't worry about when you're wearing clothes and they get wet. But short of that, if you have clothes and they're in the washing machine and you left your washing machine open and then Friday night comes and everybody went to bed, but you want to hang up your tichel or your skirt or your pants, or your shirt, I don't know, whatever it is, so it's dry for tomorrow. No. You can't touch wet clothing on Shabbos because you may wring it out, right? Like an iPhone, because you may wake it up. So you can't touch wet clothing. Not only that, but anything that was sopping wet that you weren't wearing, that sopping wet going into Shabbos is Muktzah the rest of Shabbos. That's example number 1. And example number 2 of Muktzah Machmas Isser is actually an amazing story. I mean, I don't know, I shouldn't say it's amazing. When I was living in Lakewood, learning in yeshiva, so I had a friend for Shabbos, and he wanted to play a game. I forget what the game was, but he wanted to play a game which involved writing. But he said, we'll play it without writing. So we were debating, is it mutter to play a game that involves writing? You're not going to write. Now, you're all thinking about Scrabble. You could play Scrabble on Shabbos. You know, I have a friend, a neighbor of mine years ago told me that when he was growing up, he thought the way you played Scrabble is you mark pages of a book for your number. But then he realized that's only because of Shabbos. So if you only play Scrabble on Shabbos, that's not an issue. But this was a game that we played during the week. You want to play on Shabbos, typically you write. So I have 2 shuls in Lakewood that I daven by. One of them was, I don't want to say who, but an author of an English series on the laws of Shabbos for Art Scroll. And one of them was someone who didn't write on it. Suffice it to say, they didn't agree. And it turned out that there is a halacha that any game that typically you do with writing, you shouldn't do on Shabbos without writing. Again, it wouldn't apply to Scrabble if that's the only time you play. But I would advise people who play Scrabble during the week and on Shabbos that during the week don't write because it will lead to writing. And you could. I'm not giving you a psak on that. I'm just letting you know these are examples of Muktzah because it may lead to a prohibition. Although that's how many of us would have defined Muktzah, as I pointed out, that's a separate category. So we did it, we were Yotze, we said it, and now we can move along. But for now, we're going to go back to the original intent, which is the general theme of Muktzah, things that we assume you weren't going to use on Shabbos. And the 5 categories again were because of its emotional and monetary value, because you were never planning on using it because the only thing it's used for is usher to do on Shabbos. So you weren't planning on making a phone call, so it's usher. You weren't planning on using your remote, so it's Muktzah. Things that have no inherent value, things that you can't do because the mitzvah doesn't apply, and things that were born on Shabbos. So last week, we actually gave exceptions to all of this. And you could review last week, when Muktzah doesn't exist, when you could ignore this, when an animal's in pain, when it could lead to damage, danger, I should say, or other examples, if it smells, but you can listen to last week's shir. It's actually interesting. One of the exceptions to Muktzah, maybe I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you this. I may not be allowed to tell you this. One of the exceptions to Muktzah is that you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to move Muktzah for you. But the Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim writes that rabbis shouldn't teach that halacha. They shouldn't teach that halacha because people already don't understand when you're not allowed to tell a Gentile to do something for you. So if you tell them that, it's going to lead to chaos. But because the last 3 weeks we discussed the laws of a Shabbos guy, I feel safe teaching you that leniency. Okay, so now, what are some general allowances? Meaning, I understand for certain cases, Muktzah doesn't apply, but generally Muktzah does apply. So what do I do if my iPhone is on the Shabbos table? I mean, what do I do if there's a hammer on the floor and guests are going to arrive? And more importantly, what do I do Shabbos morning when I wake up and I realize that on my balcony I left my iPhone, it's about to rain? I mean, there are so many cases where Muktzah becomes important to move. So again, the prohibition is you're not allowed to move it. You could touch it, but you can't move it. So are there any ways out of it? So the first thing I want to tell you is, of all 5 categories, the one that you may have thought is the most stringent is actually the most lenient. Things that are muktzah by dint of their prohibition, things that we assume you weren't going to use because it's also to use them on Shabbos, an iPhone, a television, a remote control, a car, all these things. Now, a car is a bad example because you can't move it just simply because you're not strong enough. But imagine you're Superman. That's the most lenient of all muktzahs. And that's what comes up the most, a hammer. These things, you're allowed to move, a television remote, you're allowed to move on Shabbos if you need the space. So if your iPhone, a telephone, a pen is a great example, right? A pen is, we assume you're not going to use it on Shabbos because the only usage is writing. So you were never planning on using it, you can't move it. That's a klisha malach or something which is muktzah because its only value is its prohibited act. If there's a pen on your chair on Shabbos, you can move it. If you need the space and your iPhone is there, let's assume your iPhone's off, so the motion won't wake it up, you can move your iPhone. You know how many times people have seen me? I remember once by Shalosh Shuddis, there was a pen on the table, and I picked it up and I walked into the kitchen, I put it down, and someone looked at me like I was a reformer rabbi. But it's halacha and Shulchan Aruch, 100% allowed, 100%. You don't need a shino, you don't have to do it in a strange way. You could just pick it up. Now, once you pick it up, the halacha is you don't have to okay, so it's let's say on my chair is a pen. So you may think you could pick it up and then drop it right away. No, once you have it in your hand, you could walk over to the junk drawer, open up the junk drawer and put it in. You could walk upstairs to your office and put it down. You could go, you should move fast, but go directly to the place of intent and drop it. It's worth coming tonight for that because that's the most common muktzah, a klisha malachto le'isser. That's what we associate with muktzah. A nail, I don't know, maybe someone else come up with a stapler, scissors, whatever the example is. There's so many examples of this type of muktzah. The most common of muktzahs, and you need to know that you're allowed to move it for its place. Now, there's another way you're allowed to move it. Nachmas Kufa, I don't want to go into that. We don't have time, but that's a very common need. So again, anything that's muktzah due to it being prohibited to be used on Shabbos, you're allowed to move it if you need the place that it's in. And you can move it in a regular fashion. Very, very important. What if, okay, but that doesn't apply to the others. All the other categories cannot be moved, even if you need the place, right? If your Babe Ruth rookie card is sitting on your chair that you plan on using on Shabbos morning, you can't pick it up. Now, is there another method? So the answer is yes. You have a few other methods. It's a little bit complex. Let me simplify it. All other categories of muktzah, if you want to move it, you need to move it. I don't know, you have guests coming and there's a bunch of rocks on the floor. Rocks are muktzah. So what do? Again, these categories don't come up so often. They really don't. The way you move it is you could shake it off the table, but what if it's, I don't know, something of value, it's going to break. So you can move it with a shinoi. You can move it with your elbows, or you certainly could kick it to the side. So you're allowed to use your body, not your hands, your body to move all other categories of muktzah. So now the remaining question is, we so far gave categories of muktzah. We said you're allowed to touch it. We said you can't move it. We said by something which is muktzah because it's forbidden on Shabbos, you can move if you needed space. All other categories you can move in an indirect manner. It's better to shake it off. If you can't shake it off, you could move it with a non-muktzah object, like, I don't know, the rookie card is on your table, so you move the table. But what if you don't want to move it because you need the space? Let's go back to the iPhone example. What if I want to move the iPhone to benefit the iPhone? The opening example I gave is, what if you left your iPhone outside and it's about to rain? So I don't need the seat outside. I just want to save my iPhone. Now, halacha is to move muktzah for the sake of muktzah. That's problematic. It could very well happen that you left your worker tools outside. You're building your sukkah Erev Shabbos. Oh, it's time for Shabbos. You'll finish it after Shabbos. You go inside. It's about to rain, but all your tools are outside, and it's going to get all rusted. And they're muktzah. Why are they muktzah? Because it's klish malach l'isser. There's something that we assume you're not using because it's only used for forbidden acts. Is there any way to move those on Shabbos? So the answer is yes. I'm going to give you two methods. So let me give you one method that only applies to forbidden things like iPhones and hammers, etc. And then I'll give you another method for everything. So if you leave your iPhone outside, once you know its category is a klish malach l'isser, you can do what's called a halachic subterfuge. This is going to be strange. But you can say, I really want to sit on my balcony. Oh, look at that. The iPhone is exactly where I want to sit. I guess I'm allowed to move it because it's where I need to be. So since you're allowed to move utensils that are forbidden, that are muktzah because they're forbidden on Shabbos, if they're in a place that you need, like your dining room table or your seat, you're allowed to create the need to be where it is so that you can move it. Is that clear? Did I explain that clearly enough?
What if it's gonna rain? Then you're not.
No, that's what I'm saying. If your iPhone's outside and it's going to rain, or it is
But
raining,
then you're not gonna go out to sit on the balcony if it's gonna
you
rain.
you're going to have to sit there. You're going to have to sit there for a minute or two. Say, isn't the rain amazing? Okay, I'm going to go in now. But it's a subterfuge. But again, we're dealing with rabbinical law, and they allow some subterfuge. When it comes to all other utensil muktzah objects, and this applies also to iPhones and hammers, and you can move it with a shinoi. So that means, again, your elbow, kick it, your body parts, blow on it if that works. So again, we typically don't move muktzah on Shabbos for the benefit of muktzah. But what I want you to remember is any category of muktzah, if to save the muktzah, you can move it in an indirect fashion. Okay. And again, I know this is a more intense, informational-oriented shiur. But again, if we're going to do muktzah in 2 weeks, this is how it has to be done. There's one final category of muktzah that Ira mentioned that we have. There's a lot more categories, but one more major category of muktzah, and that is the category of buses. The Hebrew word buses is the source for the English word basis. In fact, I'll tell you something. Tilting in halacha is called tiltal. The word tilting also came from the laws of muktzah. But so all a basis means is like this. The laws of muktzah are so severe that we view things migud iskatze. Once something was muktzah going into Shabbos, like the wet clothes, like a rock outside, it's muktzah the rest of Shabbos. I obviously could take a rock before Shabbos and say I want it to be a paperweight. That's fine. But that means that not only is, I don't know, my iPhone muktzah, but if I leave my iPhone in a drawer, that drawer becomes the basis for this. It's called a basis in Hebrew. And the drawer now is muktzah too. If I put my iPhone on a book, let me get a secular book here. If I put my iPhone on a book before Shabbos, this book now has the status of the iPhone. If it's because of its value muktzah, like the picture of your great grandmother that escaped the Holocaust, and I put this on the book, then the book becomes that category of muktzah. But in order for that to happen, you need it to be there before Shabbos, and it had to have been put there purposefully. So that comes up a lot when it comes to, let's say, moving the tray that has the Shabbos lights for people who light Shabbos candles on their table. So the old custom among Jews is they'll put on the tray, when the lights go out, they want to be able to move the tray for the day meal. But the tray now is a basis to the candles that were lit. So going into Shabbos, because you light candles before sundown, so the entire period of twilight, the muktzah was sitting on the tray. So now the tray should be muktzah the rest of Shabbos. So how are we allowed to move it? This is why people put other things of value. Maybe they'll put the challahs there, they'll put a sefer there, because something that is a basis for muktzah and non-muktzah, is chumash, whatever's more valuable to you, not monetarily, but for that day. So my chumash is more important to me on Shabbos than an iPhone is, then it's not going to become a basis. I know it's a little bit confusing. All you need to remember is whatever category muktzah is, whatever's holding it has that same category if it was there before Shabbos, unless you put something else there to balance it. That's it. You now are in the 0.00001% of Orthodox Jews in the information you have about muktzah. As I said, there's nothing here that I wouldn't teach in a smicha class. I would go into things in much more detail, but this was actually taught the same way I would teach it in a smicha class. You know a tremendous amount of material. I would advise you, if I can, to listen to last week's class and this week's class, especially last week's class, a couple of times, and it'll be important for life, for keeping Shabbos Kodesh. All right, as I said from the beginning, I have a very bad headache, so the shir is really only going to be 40 minutes this week. I hope to be in shul this Shabbos, but it's really up to the laws of the state. As I said at the beginning, it's been 7 days since a negative test at my house, so I may have to wait till Sunday. I think 10 days now is the law. I'm not really sure. If I don't see you, we'll miss you. And everybody have a wonderful evening.
Refuah Shalema. Take some Advil.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Refuah